There are some videos that you will never see. This is not because they do not exist, but because someone made sure they stayed completely hidden from the world. They are locked away in dark police evidence rooms, buried by massive corporations, or heavily redacted by government agencies until the truth is barely recognizable. These are moments so disturbing and so telling that the public was never meant to witness them. Today, we are diving into some of the most horrific lost media in existence, but not the kind you are probably thinking of. These are not missing movies or forgotten television broadcasts. These are real events, cold blooded crimes caught on camera, and mysterious disappearances tied to evidence that vanished without a trace. Let us start by going back to a cool night in Bradford, England. It was June 22nd, 2009, and it was a Monday. Most people on a Monday night are winding down from their very first day back at work. They only want to go outside if they absolutely have to. Otherwise, they want to stay bundled up inside with their families where it is warm and safe. And Susan Rushworth was no different from anyone else that night. She had just recently moved back in with her mother, and she was using this opportunity to spend some real quality time with her. Susan had struggled for the last 10 or 15 years of her life. Following a severe brain hemorrhage that caused her to develop epilepsy, Susan fell into a deep and destructive drug addiction. To fund that addiction, she eventually had to begin a life as an intimate worker on the streets of Bradford. But in early June of 2009, Susan began to turn her life around in a major way. She was a mother of 3 and a grandmother, even though she was only 43 years old. Through all her struggles, she knew that she had a better life waiting for her beyond those streets, and she was determined to find it. For 5 straight weeks, she had been 100% sober from her drug of choice. This was exactly when she moved back in with her mother, and she was feeling hope for the first time in a very long time. It was not just hope, but a real sense of normalcy that she had not felt in years. She could feel a more stable, secure, and safe way of living just within her reach. And so on June 22nd, she was one of those people who were looking forward to a relaxed night at home. But on this particular night, she also really needed something. She needed medicine of some sort to help with her condition. Thinking she would only be gone for an hour or two at the most, she walked out the door, hopped on the local bus, and started heading towards the nearby pharmacy. But at some point along her journey, she ran into a man named Stephen Griffiths. Now, Stephen was born not far outside of Bradford in a city called Dewsbury. By this point in his life, though, he resided in Bradford because he was attending the local university there. He was actually enrolled in a prestigious master's program in criminology. To anyone who met him, he seemed like a normal, highly intelligent, and friendly guy. And when he met Susan that night, he told her that he was an aspiring photographer. He claimed he was incredibly inspired by her appearance and actually wanted to take some photographs of her for an upcoming project. He explained that he was creating a series of pictures of women lying on his bed, and he said these pictures would eventually go up in a professional art gallery exhibit in the city. I feel like a lot of people would be creeped out or at least highly cautious when presented with an offer like that from a stranger. But Stephen was pursuing his master's degree. He seemed smart, charming, and very ambitious. For Susan, the idea seemed interesting and maybe even like a door opening for her. It was an opportunity that could offer her a new path in life if this Stephen guy was actually who he claimed to be. And in a way, he was. He really was a student, and in a way, he was a kind of photographer. But the real problem was not what he said. The problem was what he did not say. What Susan did not know was that Stephen came from an extremely troubled childhood. There is actually not a lot of information available about his early years, other than one highly disturbing detail. When he was very young, he had a habit of watching his mother have intimacy with many different men in their garden. That does not really point to someone having a happy or healthy adolescence. Neither does the fact that when he was 17 years old, he attempted to shoplift at a local supermarket. When he was caught by the staff, he did not just run away. Instead, he pulled out a knife and slashed the cashier's face with it. He added even more to his criminal record years later when he held a knife to a young girl's throat. He was convicted and jailed for both of those violent incidents. And when he was in prison, he openly confessed to having a deep fascination with serial killers. He did not stop there either. He told people he had a dream of following down that exact same path. He really did say that out loud to prison staff and psychiatrists. He let everyone know that his ultimate goal in life was to become a professional murderer. So that begs the question, was he studying criminology to work in the criminal justice system? Or was he doing it to better understand the minds of the people who commit these crimes so he could get away with it? And on top of that, and more importantly, was it really just pictures he wanted of Susan? Well, like in any good horror movie, this can only be described as a scene where you want to yell at the screen and beg the main character not to open the door. The door we all know the killer is hiding behind. No matter how much we want Susan to go get her medicine, get back on the bus, and go back home to her mother, that is unfortunately not what happened. She ended up going into Stephen's apartment, and it was there that Stephen tried his hand at the very thing he had been infatuated with for so long. He murdered her using a crossbow. Then, to make it even more vile and disgusting, he dismembered her body and actually ate some of the parts that he had removed. The evidence for this came from tiny traces of blood that were later discovered in Stephen's apartment, but it would be a very long time until that was found. Susan's body was tragically never recovered, and without that evidence, it would be another entire year before Stephen was finally outed as the monster he truly was, and it would be another year until he struck again. On April 26th, 2010, he lured a woman named Shelley Armitage into his apartment. He used the exact same photographer excuse that he had used on Susan. Just like Susan, Shelley had also struggled with a severe drug addiction for many years of her life. But shortly before April 26th, she had gotten a new puppy that she was absolutely obsessed with. She loved this puppy, and it was the one thing in her life that was helping her slowly change her habits and build a better future. But while she thought she would only be leaving her dog for a couple of hours that night, the two of them would never get to be together again. Shelley fell into the exact same tragic fate as Susan, except this time Stephen wanted to fully document his work. After murdering her with a crossbow, he took out a camera and filmed himself dismembering her body, narrating the entire process as he did it. And if you thought it could not get any more sickening, he also took spray paint and wrote the words "my slave" on her back, all while looking at the camera and saying, "I am the venom pariah. I am the bloodbath artist. Here is a model who is assisting me. It is absolutely blood boiling that these innocent women, both of whom were full of potential and trying to turn their lives around, had to meet this disgusting creature. He was someone who killed them in such a revolting way that no human being should ever have to endure. But people like Steven never stop on their own. And on May 21st, 2010, he went out prowling the streets once again, looking for another person to trick back into his apartment. This time, he targeted a woman named Suzanne Blamires. Yet again, she was a woman who was out on the streets after going through a couple of incredibly hard years and struggling with addiction. At this point, it is incredibly obvious that Steven had a pattern. It was not a coincidence. He was specifically finding women who were in vulnerable positions. They all had extremely difficult lives and did not feel like they had many options to create a better future for themselves. And all of them were working as intimate workers at the time, which meant they often found themselves in sketchy situations. But more often than not, those encounters worked out fine, and they were used to dealing with creepy men. While Steven might not have seemed like the nicest guy in the world, he probably just seemed like the rest of them. A little bit weird, maybe a bit off, but not a cold-blooded killer. And like the others, Steven tried to take advantage of Suzanne. But, unlike the previous victims, Suzanne did not fully buy into what he was selling. Maybe she did at first, but at some point on the way up to his apartment, she got a terrible gut feeling. She realized she needed to leave immediately, but escaping was not going to be that simple. She tried to leave peacefully at first, but when she realized that was not an option, she made a run for it. And Steven was right behind her. Now, the two of them were in the hallway of the apartment building. Suzanne was running as fast as her legs could carry her, praying that she could find a way out of this living nightmare. But Steven was faster, and he was much bigger than her. When he tackled her to the ground, she fought back with everything she had, but it was no use. He shot her with his crossbow, and Suzanne was gone. As he dragged her lifeless body back toward his apartment, he realized something that would change everything. There was a security camera mounted in the corner of the hallway, watching everything. It had captured the entire horrifying act of violence and the evil of Steven Griffiths. But this security camera being there was not a random coincidence. It was not just a standard security measure for the apartment building, because when Steven had been convicted of his previous violent crimes, all of his open talk about wanting to become a serial killer had deeply worried law enforcement. For the 2 years leading up to these murders, the police had actually been keeping a very close eye on him. They had even gone so far as to confiscate his hunting guns. But when they noticed that he was checking out and reading books on dismemberment, they decided to contact the housing association where he lived. That was when they decided to install extremely high-quality closed-circuit television cameras right near Steven's apartment door. If it had not been for those cameras, there is no telling when Steven's killing spree would have actually ended. 3 days after Suzanne was murdered, an employee of the housing association was reviewing the security footage and found the tape. It is absolutely horrible that an innocent worker had to witness the sheer horror of what Steven was capable of. But thanks to that worker's bravery and immediate willingness to contact the police, Steven Griffiths was finally caught. On December 21st, 2010, he was convicted of all 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison. During the court proceedings, he actually gave himself the nickname the Crossbow Cannibal. But behind that dramatic persona was just a pathetic, sick, and disgusting man. While it is incredibly relieving that some justice was finally served for these victims and their grieving families, what is truly chilling is that there may be more to his past than these 3 women. When he was arrested, he actually confessed to killing a total of 5 intimate workers, which means there are still 2 victims who are completely unaccounted for. One of these potential victims is a woman named Rebecca Hall. Her body was found only 870 yards away from Stephen's apartment, and she was certainly not a stranger to him. He actually had her over to his place quite often. The police had many strong reasons to believe that her murder was directly connected to Stephen, but when he was questioned about her, he remained completely silent. And that is exactly how he has remained ever since. Although he admitted to 5 killings in total, he refuses to talk to the police about any other details or victims. So, what we know right now is pretty much all we will ever know unless Stephen decides to finally open his mouth. Any other information or potential victims are completely lost to us and to law enforcement. The same is true for the footage of the murders of Shelley and Suzanne. The videos and photographs that Stephen took of Shelley were actually found on a mobile phone that he had accidentally left behind on a train. That phone actually circulated around and was sold twice to different people before someone realized what was on it and handed it over to the police, where it has remained ever since. The security camera footage of Suzanne has only been partially released to the public. NBC News broadcasted a short clip of him flipping off the camera after he discovered it was there, as well as a brief moment of him chasing her down the hallway. But all of the footage and pictures of the actual violent acts are completely unavailable to the public. And honestly, I cannot say that is something I would ever want to see released. Stephen Griffiths is an evil man, and the things he did to those women are absolutely revolting. It turns my stomach to even think about it. Just like the apartment employee who found the tape, it would be deeply traumatizing for anyone to watch. It is not something the public needs to see. Stephen will spend the rest of his life rotting away in a maximum security prison cell, and all proof of what he did to Susan, Shelley, and Suzanne will remain locked away in a police evidence room forever. Now, let us transition to a very different kind of horror. A story about a monster, but not a human one. Or perhaps a monster created entirely by human hands. If you travel to the waters of Iceland, you will find thousands of killer whales residing in the cold ocean. Today, they get to freely roam the North Atlantic, living peaceful lives inside their families, which are known as pods. But this was not always what life was like for an Icelandic orca. From 1975 to 1989, there were approximately 64 wild killer whales captured for the sole purpose of being placed in aquariums and marine parks all over the world. You probably know one of them very well. Keiko, the famous whale from the movie Free Willy. He was captured in 1979, but he was actually lucky enough to be released back into his natural habitat in 2002. But some whales did not get that level of stardom, nor did they get the happy ending that plays when the credits roll on a movie screen. Meet Tilikum. Tilikum was captured in 1983 when he was only 2 years old. What started as an average, peaceful day for him turned into a living nightmare. He was likely hunting, socializing, or playing with his family. He was just living his normal everyday whale life in the vast ocean until all of a sudden his entire world exploded. Massive boats came speeding around him and his pod, chasing them into shallow coves. As they were quite literally being cornered, the peaceful and natural sounds of the ocean were suddenly replaced by total chaos. The people on the boats were throwing explosives into the water to disorient and terrify Tilikum and his family, and it was Tilikum they were after. Young calves were highly targeted during these captures because they were easier to transport, and he was no exception. And while orcas are extremely intelligent and powerful creatures, the violent nature of this kidnapping was not something they could fight against. Tilikum was taken. His mother chased the boat for miles and miles, completely exhausting herself, crying out for her baby until she physically could not anymore. But the boat just kept going and going until eventually Tilikum could no longer hear his mother's voice. He spent about a year at an aquarium in Iceland before being moved to Sealand of the Pacific in British Columbia, Canada. Here he was forced to perform tricks for crowds in exchange for frozen fish. All the while, he was being kept in an extremely small holding tank with 2 other female orcas. None of the whales had the adequate space they needed to live peacefully, which led to immense tension inside the enclosure. Tilikum's roommates were just as miserable with their situation as he was, and they often took their frustration and anger out on him. They would harass and attack him all night long. He was often seen by staff covered in thousands of open cuts and teeth rakes all over his body. Luckily, this specific torture only lasted for a little while until he was moved to a somewhat better living situation. He was sent to SeaWorld in Orlando, Florida in 1992, where he was intended to be used primarily as a breeder. But when I say a somewhat better situation, keep in mind that this is highly relative. Here, he did not have other dominant orcas constantly bullying him all day, but it still was not the Atlantic Ocean. It was not even close. In his natural habitat, a male killer whale would dive up to 1,000 feet deep and travel up to 140 miles in a single day. At SeaWorld, his tank was at its deepest point, only 34 feet. For comparison, a standard bowling lane is 60 feet long. That means a bowling ball can travel further in a straight line than one of the largest apex predators on Earth could swim in his tank. It is absolutely outrageous. And while Tilikum did his job as a breeder, fathering 21 calves, he was living in absolute hell. All of his natural instincts and needs were completely suppressed. He was thousands of miles away from his home and his family, and he spent a vast majority of his time completely isolated in a dark tank. He was miserable, but on July 6th, 1999, there was one man who wanted to try and change that. He wanted to become friends with Tilikum and maybe even have his own magical, real-life Free Willy experience. This man was named Daniel P. Dukes. Daniel was originally from South Carolina, and how he actually ended up in Orlando is not fully known. He was sort of a drifter, moving from place to place without much of a permanent home. He lived on the very outskirts of society, actually residing at a local Hare Krishna temple at the time. Though it was a peaceful Hindu place of worship, it is hard to say exactly what kind of life Daniel led, as he had actually been in jail just a week before July 6th, apparently for stealing a simple candy bar. But what is far more questionable than his past crimes are the decisions he made on the night he met Tilikum. At some point during the night, after the park had closed to the public, Daniel managed to sneak past all of SeaWorld's security guards, climb over the high fences, and slip into the cold water of the pool where Tilikum was kept. What happened next is impossible to say for sure, but at 7:20 in the morning, when a physical therapist named Michael Doherty arrived at the park for his morning shift, he noticed something in the water. It was something so horrific he almost did not want to look, but he had to. And when he looked closer into the water, he found Daniel's body on top of Tilikum. This was not a playful joyride. Daniel was laying across the whale's back, completely naked and stiff. Michael described him as being in full rigor mortis when he was discovered, meaning he had been dead for hours. Once Daniel's body was recovered and examined by a coroner, it became painfully clear that he had sustained a massive number of severe injuries both before and after his death. The autopsy report is incredibly long and highly graphic, so I will not go into all of the details here, but Tilikum had absolutely mutilated him. The damage was so severe that one of the employees who witnessed the aftermath said the body had no clothes left on it and was so badly disfigured that they could not even tell if the person was male or female. So it is really no mystery how Daniel died. Obviously, his bright idea of going for a midnight swim with a 12,000-pound wild predator in captivity was incredibly foolish. But what I and many other people have a very hard time understanding is how Daniel even managed to get in there in the first place. SeaWorld is a massive multi-million-dollar operation. It is a company that employs security guards and staff overnight for the very specific purpose of watching the orcas 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This was done to prevent the exact scenario that happened to Daniel. Yet, somehow, this guy managed to get past all of the security patrols, climb multiple barriers, and slip into the tank completely unnoticed. I know the guy was good at slipping away, but sneaking into a high-security marine park and swimming with a killer whale feels like a completely different level of difficulty. But it is impossible to know exactly how he did it, because SeaWorld claimed to the police and the public that they had absolutely no security camera footage of the incident. Now, killer whales might not have a sense of smell, but I certainly do. And I can smell something highly suspicious from a mile away. There is simply no way on Earth that one of the largest marine parks in the world, holding an incredibly valuable and potentially dangerous 12,000-pound animal, did not have a single security camera pointed at that tank. If that were actually true, then the management at SeaWorld would have to be absolute idiots. Unless, of course, that part of their story was completely made up to protect themselves from a massive lawsuit. It has been heavily speculated that Daniel was actually found much earlier than 7:20 in the morning, and that when he was first discovered, he was actually still alive. Why would SeaWorld lie about that? Well, because if they admitted to finding him alive and failing to save him, or if they admitted their security was so poor that a man could drown in their tanks for hours, they would be held legally and financially responsible for his death. By painting the story in a way that blamed Daniel entirely, calling him an unstable intruder who snuck in with bad intentions, they could shift all of the blame away from their own negligence. They even tried to portray him as a troubled individual who just wanted to die, but people who knew him said that was not true. There was a famous marine mammal trainer named Rick O'Barry who spoke out about his beliefs on the matter. He made it clear that Daniel was likely not malicious or suicidal, but rather deeply fascinated by Tilikum. And Tilikum was not a mindless killer either. Rick explained that the whale probably pulled Daniel down and held him underwater without realizing that humans cannot hold their breath like whales do. He pointed out that these animals have absolutely nothing to do all day. They are trapped in tiny, boring tanks, and they are literally bored to death. It is like a human being living their entire life inside a small bathroom. I do not think anyone could have said it better. But despite the heavy backlash from marine animal experts and the public, SeaWorld never took real accountability for what happened. In fact, 11 years later, another horrific tragedy occurred. A highly experienced trainer named Don Broncho was working with Tilikum during a live show when the whale suddenly grabbed her by her ponytail and pulled her deep into the water. She tragically drowned and suffered massive blunt force trauma that led to her death. But even after killing another human being, Tilikum was forced to return to performing just a year later. He spent the rest of his life swimming in circles in that same tank until he finally died in 2016 from a severe bacterial infection. What is so tragic about his death is that he never got the chance to experience freedom again. He never got to go back to his family in the ocean. And while Tilikum's story is over, SeaWorld still holds other orcas captive for entertainment to this day. And just like the truth about what happened to Daniel P. Dukes, the footage of that night remains completely lost. While there are confirmed photographs of Daniel's body being carried on the whale's back, taken by park staff for evidence, those photos and any surveillance footage that might exist have never been released to the public. They are likely locked away in an FBI evidence file, never to see the light of day. We will probably never know if Daniel fell in, if he was pulled in, or if he cried out for help while fighting for his life in the dark. Now, let us transition to our final story. A case about a person who did not die in a highly publicized incident, but who instead vanished into the shadows of a system that seemed all too eager to forget she ever existed. A story where the only clues left behind are heavily redacted, hidden away from the very people who deserve answers. Let us go back to the mid-1980s in Kamloops, British Columbia. Kamloops is a city incredibly rich with natural beauty, surrounded by stunning mountains and rivers. It is a major hub for outdoor enthusiasts who spend their days hiking, mountain biking, skiing, and exploring. It is a place that seems to bubble over with energy and joy. But not everyone in Kamloops was living that picture-perfect life. For two young foster children who had recently moved back to the area, Norman Jr. and Kim LaRue, life was about as far away from that picture-perfect image as you could possibly get. The two children were born from a prestigious line of hereditary chiefs of the Neskinlith Native American Band, located in the Shuswap district. Their father, Norman Sr., was where that long hereditary line unfortunately came to an end. His election as chief had been overturned due to voting irregularities, a detail that remains vague and unexplained. But the struggles of Norman Sr.'s life likely played a major role in how everything fell apart. Norman Sr. had been born on a reservation and was eventually sent to a Native American residential school. If you know anything about Canadian history, you know that these boarding schools were designed to systematically strip Native children of their culture and force them to integrate into European Canadian society. It was a deeply flawed and cruel system, and a massive amount of physical and emotional abuse occurred at these schools. Norman Sr. was a victim of that horrific abuse. And even worse for him, the pain did not stop when he finally went home. He was neglected and abused by his own family. At a very young age, he was already binge drinking with his father, blacking out with the very parent who was supposed to be raising and protecting him. This destructive cycle did not stop as Norman grew older and had children of his own. His drinking got worse and worse, eventually spiraling into severe chronic alcoholism. When he could manage to stay sober, people said he was an amazing man to be around. He was highly intelligent, incredibly charming, and very ambitious. But the moment a single drop of alcohol entered his system, he transformed into an entirely different person. He became violent, aggressive, and highly dangerous. This quickly led to severe abuse, directed toward his wife and his young children. All of the deep-seated rage and trauma he carried was taken out on them. His wife, the mother of Kim and Norman Jr., was also no stranger to addiction, but after realizing that this lifestyle was going to destroy their family, she managed to sober up and actually became a professional addictions counselor. But unfortunately, the damage to the children had already been done. In the mid 80s, the government stepped in and placed the children into the foster care system. They were bounced around from one foster home to another for a while, but they eventually landed with a family in northern British Columbia. While many of the foster homes the kids experienced were far from perfect, this particular home was absolutely terrible. The two young children were completely terrified, but Kim and Norman Jr. were not entirely alone in their struggle. Enter Danielle LaRue. Danielle was the oldest of the three siblings, and she took her role as the big sister very seriously. Her family gave her the nickname Holy Smoke because of how incredibly fearless she was. She was a total spitfire. She was never afraid to say what was on her mind or do whatever it took to stand up for her younger brother and sister. When the kids were taken by the state, Kim and Norman Jr. were kept together, but Danielle was separated and sent to a different home. But Danielle knew her siblings were in danger, and the physical distance between them meant absolutely nothing to her. At the young age of only 10 years old, Danielle managed to escape her own foster home, travel across the province, and sneak into the house where her brother and sister were being kept. She took them by the hand and ran away with them, keeping them hidden where she knew they would be safe under her protection. To the police, this was technically considered a kidnapping, but to anyone with a heart, it was an act of incredible bravery and sisterly love. Eventually, under intense pressure and force from the authorities, Danielle had to give her siblings back to the foster family. But her fight was incredibly strong, and it showed just how much her family meant to her. Unfortunately, there was only so much a young girl could do against the system. Eventually, the abuse Danielle suffered in her own foster homes became too much to bear, and she ran away for good. After her father was convicted of a murder in 1989, Danielle was left completely on her own, living on the streets of Vancouver while she was still barely a teenager. To survive out there, she had to turn to intimate work. Life on the streets was unimaginably brutal. Haunted by the trauma of her childhood and tormented by her current situation, Danielle had to find some way to cope with the immense pain she was feeling. Following the tragic path that her father had walked before her, Danielle turned to heavy drugs. It is a heartbreaking but highly predictable outcome for a child who had been failed by every single adult and institution in her life. It was her last resort, the only way to temporarily escape the living hell she was trapped in. Her sister Kim, who also briefly fell into a similar pattern of addiction, later described the experience in a way that helps explain why it was so hard for Danielle to escape. Kim said that the moment you take those drugs, you do not feel the pain anymore. It makes everything feel okay. It makes everything feel good, and that is something that is incredibly difficult to walk away from when your sober life is filled with nothing but misery. But Danielle did not want to deal with her pain through therapy or rehab. Whenever her family begged her to get help, she would always say that she had plenty of time to straighten her life out later. But tragically, for Danielle, there would be no later. Any opportunity she had to build a better life was slowly slipping away. Instead of moving forward, she only spiraled deeper and deeper into the dark. Eventually, this spiral led her to the notorious downtown east side of Vancouver. Kim later remarked that everyone in British Columbia knew that once you went to the downtown east side, you were essentially finished. You were either going to end up dead or in a prison cell. Those were the only two exits available to you. She described it as a massive black pit filled with violence, stabbings, and drug overdoses. It was a place where nobody cared about anyone else, and everyone was just focused on their next fix. Danielle managed to survive in that environment for a while, but Kim's dark description of the area was completely accurate. A person can only last in a place like that for so long before something gives. And when the Vancouver Police Department finally reported Danielle missing on May 12th, 2003, that was the first explanation that came to everyone's mind, but the police did not jump to any quick conclusions. Or, if they did, they shared almost nothing about it with the public. At a brief press conference that day, they simply stated that an anonymous person had reported Danielle missing. They noted that she had not been seen since November of 2002, and they asked the public for any information. The announcement was so vague and short that almost no media outlets even bothered to cover it. The only exception was a single newspaper article published a week later in the Vancouver Sun, written by a journalist named Daphne Bramham. The article was titled, "What is Missing Here is Justice." In her piece, the journalist heavily criticized the Vancouver police for waiting a staggering 6 months before making Danielle's disappearance public. Her anger was entirely justified. Danielle's case had been completely swept under the rug by law enforcement, and that is exactly how it remained for the next 4 years. Finally, in 2007, the case was brought back into the light by a reporter named John Daly. He was writing a comprehensive story about the high number of unsolved murders and disappearances of intimate workers in British Columbia, and he included a section specifically about Danielle, but he also revealed one crucial detail that changed the entire nature of the case. It turned out that the police had left out a massive piece of information during their original press conference back in 2003. On New Year's Eve in 2002, just a month after Danielle was last seen, the police had received a highly unusual anonymous letter. The writer of this letter wrote that they had sent a message to the police a few days after the incident, but had seen absolutely nothing about it in the news. They assumed the police either did not receive the first message or could not match the information to a specific victim. So, they decided to write again, providing additional details. The writer stated that this was regarding a Vancouver intimate worker who had disappeared at the end of November in 2002. They did not remember the name she had given them, and she carried no identification. They wrote that she sounded like she had only recently arrived in Vancouver and described her as Caucasian, with long black curly hair, wearing jeans, a black leather jacket, tattoos, and jewelry. And then the writer added two chilling words: "She is dead." Following that statement, the police redacted several lines of the letter before releasing it to the public, but the next part they allowed people to see was equally disturbing. The writer went on to say that they were sending this information so the police could notify her family. They asked the police to please mention her name in the Vancouver Sun newspaper because they wanted to know who she actually was. Again, the police redacted another large paragraph of the letter, but the final section was left visible, and it was addressed directly to Danielle's family. The writer wrote that they were more sorry for what had happened than anyone could ever imagine. They claimed they did not intend for this to happen, but acknowledged that they were still entirely responsible. They wrote that they wished they could take it back, but they could not. They promised that she would not go unmourned and revealed that they had already brought flowers to her grave once and planned to do so every single year if they were able to. They acknowledged that the family could never forgive them, but begged them to believe that they had tried their absolute best to bring her back. The reporter, John Daly, explained that the police had strong reasons to believe the woman described in this letter was indeed Danielle LaRue. But what remains incredibly unclear is whether the person who wrote this letter was the same anonymous source who originally reported her missing to the police, or if they were two entirely different people. It simply does not make sense why the police waited so long to announce her disappearance if they had received this letter on New Year's Eve. It feels like there must be so much more information that they are keeping hidden from the public. The description of the woman in the letter is somewhat generic, and it does not automatically point to Danielle without some other piece of connecting evidence that the police have refused to share. The entire situation would likely make a lot more sense if the authorities would just release the redacted portions of the letter. But instead, they have kept those details completely secret. And what about the first letter the writer claimed to have sent just days after the incident? Why did the police never mention receiving that one? It is almost shocking that the anonymous writer of the letter seemed to care more about getting justice and giving the family closure than the actual police department did. Perhaps some of the blacked out information is highly graphic or sensitive, or perhaps Danielle's family requested that it not be made public, which is certainly understandable. But this is an active missing persons case. Giving the public access to all of the available information could be the key to finding her body or identifying the person responsible. As it stands, the heavily censored information has not led anyone to the truth. If you visit the Vancouver Police Department's cold case website, you will find that Danielle's case is still officially open. It was last updated in August of 2016, 14 long years after she vanished. 14 years of agonizing heartbreak and unanswered questions for her siblings, Norman Jr. and Kim. But Kim does not hold out much hope of finding her sister alive. She knows all too well the devastating reality of life on the streets and heavy drug addiction, and she believes that Danielle's life came to a tragic and violent end. Kim later said that she does not think anything could have ultimately saved Danielle. When a person is abused to the extreme extent that Danielle was throughout her entire childhood, the damage is often too deep to repair. It is incredibly tragic that someone as brave, loving, and fiercely protective as Danielle had to endure such a brutal existence and meet such a cruel, lonely end. But the incredible resilience she possessed did not die with her. It lived on in her younger sister, Kim. Despite the bleak reality of the downtown east side, where almost nobody escapes, Kim managed to do the impossible. When she was offered a ticket out of British Columbia, she took it and never looked back. She sobered up, got a stable job, and made plans to attend university to study law. While we may never know the full truth of what happened to Danielle, I like to think that wherever she is looking down with immense pride at her little sister. Kim did what they both dreamed of doing. She beat the system, broke the cycle of abuse, and built a beautiful life for herself. And perhaps one day, the police will finally release the fully uncensored letter, and the LaRue family will finally get the answers and the justice they have deserved for so long. But until that day comes, we are left staring at the blacked out lines of a letter, wondering what secrets are being kept from us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.